Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Rudy El-Houri, Dean of the School of Architecture. This is the last installment in our Tecnoglass series. And this is the 10th year anniversary of this series. So I want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors who have graciously and generously supported this series for 10 years, Tecnoglass. And on this occasion, we decided to actually celebrate those 10 years by bringing back the highlights, basically, of the series, hence the mixtape theme of the poster. And we are also continuing with a new tradition, inviting students to introduce our guest speakers. So now I would like to call Catherine Ferreira, who's our presenter this evening. Thank you, Catherine.
Good evening. For Nader Tehrani, architecture is not simply an object. It is an act of assembly. It begins with matter, with grain, with weight, with the quiet intelligence of materials. Wood does not hide how it grows. Steel does not forget the forces it carries. Each element arrives with its own logic. In architecture and his work becomes the careful negotiation between them. In the Melbourne School of Design, this negotiation is made visible. Structure is not concealed but revealed. Light is not added but shaped. Circulation is not imposed but discovered. The building does not just house learning, it performs it, exposing the very system that brings it into being. His work asks us to slow down, to look again, to understand that what appears simple is often the result of layered decisions, of forces aligned, of materials understood, of details resolved with intentions. And perhaps that is what Tehrani offers us, not just buildings, but a way of thinking, where design is inseparable from making, and where meaning is constructed pieces by pieces. From the RISD Fleet Library to projects like the HIM Research Building, his work continues to explore how architecture can reveal its own making, inviting us not just to see it, but to understand it. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Nader Tehrani.
That was an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here and to be back to Miami. It's always a pleasure to come back. I got my first visiting stint here, and so it has a special place in my heart. Well, tonight I will speak to you about the sixth elevation. From a conceptual perspective, it's relatively straightforward. The elevation or the facade, what you and I normatively associate with the facade of the building, the enclosure of a building, has a both performative aspect to it, but also an important symbolic one. Sixth, because it is not the fifth. Once in a while, the roof of a building has such a figural presence that it takes on the persona of the facade even more than the traditional facade might do. But somewhere in the post-war period, the idea of the ceiling, or what I'm calling the reflected ceiling plan or the suspended ceiling, takes on a whole other vocation. It's quite normative. We're not in one of those spaces right now, but we've all been in those spaces. The kind of the monstrous, 2x2 panels, that hide all of the mechanical engineering, the sprinkler system, and all of that. They're vital to the contemporary predicament of building, because in effect they hold everything in place, but they also ruin everything. And so there's a dimension of architecture that arguably is about transcending the terms of the everyday, and rarely does it get to do that. Now, there was, of course, a time where, the idea of the dome and the ceiling were one. And I had this incredible fortune of going back to Rome recently as part of the American Academy. And I got to follow all of the footsteps that I had done some 20, 30 years before that, entering into the courtyard of the Tempietto, being on axis with the door, going inside and recognizing the altar, as it were, a kind of stone monolith that is on the perimeter of the wall with the oculus on the floor. I just remembered that I'd forgotten the building, as it were. I looked down into the crypt, not realizing that there was this other space there. And, in search of what's going on down there, I went to the back because there was no stair inside, and I realized there is a window that actually opens up into that space that gives it light. And to give you a hint about how this building works, I had to go to the drawings of Daniel Castor to fully understand it. He does this flip-flop drawing of Berlache's the Berlache building in Amsterdam, where he uses the isometric, which has this unique function of being drawn at 120, 120, 120 degrees. It is not a plan oblique. It is not an elevation oblique. It's clinical in that whether you rotate it this way, or this way, it always looks flattened out. But if you look carefully at the drawing, you see that the sectional cut through the window allows you to see the outside and the inside of the window at the same time. And you can look down on the stairs and up at the ceiling at the same time. It's a kind of ingenious drawing. And I came to realize immediately that the Tempietto is one such instance. In the Tempietto, there is no such thing as an altar without a window, and nor is there a window without the altar. And this drawing just begins to show you that. And so, kind of using the model of Castor, I decided that would be my contribution to the American Academy. You look down on the dome from outside, and then up at the dome from the inside. You look down on the altar, and then up at the window opening. You look up at the dome of the crypt again, and then down on the floor of the crypt. And of course, right at the very bottom, in its own nodule, stands St. Peter's. And for those of you who are Catholic, it's an unmistakable fact that in deference to Jesus, he was asked to be crucified upside down, making him the only saint that would have appreciated the reflected ceiling plan as he did. Now, the idea of connecting the Tempietto to St. Peter's is no coincidence. They're double shells, just like the Duomo in Florence. And in fact, Soltania, that was built some 100 years before the Duomo in Florence, is known to be possibly one of the precedents that traveled across from the Silk Road all the way to Italy. But it's this incredible structure, one of the 5 largest domes in the world, and that the iconography of the interior of the dome is completely distinct from that of the outside. And that is not different, actually, than its Western counterparts, is that the function of the interior of a dome may have to do with the representation of the heavens, but the function of the dome within the city has to do with its presence in the skyline. And so the kind of symbolic richness of this inside-outside condition is certainly not something that we can relish when we're dealing with fluorescent lights and diffusers and sprinkler systems. And yet, this is the world in which you and I live, so we better take advantage of it. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is just to take you through a series of calisthenics first, about like normative conditions, and then somehow how the normative leads to let's say extraordinary geometric conditions that we've found to adorn certain early projects, and then how that leads to larger and more complex institutional projects that we're dealing with now. In the context of the School of Architecture at the University of Nebraska, we were dealing with the kind of the ethics of bare minimalism. The budget required it. The protocols of construction required it. We had to have, I had only budget for 3 visits to the site. And so everything had to be prefabricated, the steel package, the mass timber package, as well as the cal wall package. And so accordingly, the services of the building had to be completely exposed. And so there was something about the rawness of its systems and the way that they telegraphed through the facade that became part of the ethos of that building. But long before that happened, we were confronted with a far more interesting situation at Northeastern University, where the multi-faith chapel, essentially the chapel that housed all of the different Christian faith groups, had to change. It had to change because there were students from the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the Buddhist community, and they required a different way of reckoning with the rituals that they had to undergo. And you couldn't have the cross in there and certain other attributes. So part of that strategy was to develop a series of 3 domes that had nothing to do with the symbolism of the dome, but rather they were a plenum space within which there was no single diffuser, but rather the entire perforation of the dome became the mechanism through which you regulated air. You have to imagine that this space sometimes is filled with 150, 200 people, and other times with only 3 people. So the functionality of the apertures within this ceiling have something to do with the bearing of weight of the dome. They're more like draped vaults, upside down, as it were. And then all coming together around, the oculus in the center that allows you to point east towards Mecca or west or centralize based on the configurations that the space would undertake. And then we tested this out because of our interest in materiality in a variety of calisthenics that we did in those early years. Working with very economical sheetrock, how to make the act of going to the bathroom a slightly more noble act. In this case, the bathroom at Bank, but also sometimes in learning lessons about construction, we had a very difficult task about how to build a dome ourselves after the contractor had told us that a simple hookah den, a small pavilion, would cost $200,000. We were young, we were relatively innocent, and there was no reason to disbelieve the contractor, but we realized we didn't have the money for that. So what we did, and this is, by the way, in the early days with Monica Ponce de Leon, who went to school here, we printed out that drawing at full scale. And then we hung plumb bobs from it and realized that you can get a very complex geometry from that dome and build 7 layers in one day, which means that you can build the entire structure in 30 days for $30,000 plus profit for ourselves. And so we stepped into the position of contractor at that point. This led to other projects in which we took on slightly more complex roles. The sort of infamous contractor of all of the Dunkin' Donuts in Boston got the commission to build Bank, the restaurant, based on a series of flat templates that shrink wrap the mechanical systems and the services of the apartment building above it in this space. For us, what was important for this restaurant was to maintain a relative openness for the restaurant so that it could become a single space for parties or be divided by the banquettes into smaller units, but have something larger than its sum of its parts through this organic geometry that is effectively a simple series of templates. You and I have all made these models for our studios where you cut out each topo at one line, but effectively it's a 2.5 dimensional system whereby you get a compound curvature based on the repetition of this proscenium over and over. There are other systems that we've tested out. For instance, the low resolution surface with the introduction of a single triangulation that in this case for the upper crust, we slung another surface of very economical aluminum panels, mass customized, triangulated to shrink wrap around the existing MEP there. And then finally, all of this led to this a much more elaborate project for Goldman Sachs, where issues of acoustics, mechanical engineering, sprinkler systems, lighting were all synthesized in a way more complex arrangement. The building, of course, is by Harry Cobb, and he essentially brought on a dozen, 24 younger architects to fit out the different spaces. We happened to do the dining and servery areas, which allowed us to take this idea to another level. And in this case, whereas everything looks complex and mass customized, in fact, 90% of them are flat panels just rotating with ruled surfaces, meaning they're a flat surface that's slightly torqued. And the compound curvature is reserved, or the customized pieces are only 10, 15% of them. So as all of this translates to slightly more complex programs, projects, we had the opportunity to do a very economical house for dear friends of mine, Jackie Sococha and Carl Dalvia, who were classmates of Rodolphe and mine at RISD. And they loved my apartment, which is a loft that is about 60 feet long with just a bookshelf on one edge. And the entire library is in that book. They said, we want something like this. They're avid readers. And but they needed something that had some private areas, let's say in the poché, but they wanted just one open area. And so imagine if you start with the program or the plan on the left, we ended up with the plan on the right, realizing that this singular triangulated division could possibly produce a condition that brings together effectively or more effectively the idea of the books, but with the private and public areas divided by a single line. Again, the bedroom, the bathrooms, the kitchens, the entry, all is in the dark area, and the living, dining, and all of that is on the other side, while the roof is rotating to the other side. So effectively, if the space is pointing to one direction, the roof is pointing to the other direction, with all of the water being held in a cistern on the northeastern edge of the property. So effectively, the house results in a bookshelf forcing this perspective towards the corner of the house where you get into their bedroom. And then accordingly, there's an attribute, if you like, for each function of the program. The chimney, of course, being the hearth being associated with the living room, the kitchen effectively with the dining room, the entryway with the kind of opening up of the view towards the mountain silhouettes beyond. There was a library before, now there's a staircase to the basement, but and then finally the bedroom towards the back. Anyway, these are episodes that are then marked off almost as typological moments within what is otherwise a continuous moment, looking back in the opposite direction towards the south. Now, the weird thing about this house is that you would imagine that the energy of the house is garnered from the south, but the reality is that the view is on the west. And so somehow we needed to get the maximum amount of light and heat from the clerestory towards the south, while minimizing the loss of energy on the west, but still getting the best of views on that side, and opening it up onto the deck that then points towards the view. This similar strategy of the roof, that is the ceiling, as a kind of striated ruled surface, becomes much more operative in the Dorchester Library, the Adams Library, with the monumentally stretched pediment on the main street, but the broken down domestic structures of the programs in the back, where the back alley of the library is. It's a matte building, but we sort of have one roof that brings all the water and saves it in the water garden in the back, bringing in southern light and framing a view of an 100-year-old oak tree towards the north. As with all libraries, it is a panoptic plan with, the adults, the adolescents, and the children in 3 different wings, with shelving north-south, but the beams are all going east-west to produce the continuity of that 6th elevation, which is then in evidence as you go through the space. The striation from the large pediment to the broken down ones are what also frame the view towards the garden. In effect, those striations are beams, they are acoustic baffles, they are lighting, they're diffusers, they're sprinkler systems. It's raw, it's dumb, it's pretty straightforward, but also it has a kind of organic fit, and also the roof has a kind of elevational quality because the triple deckers actually look down onto this building. Other more complex infrastructural projects like MIT involved another commission that was saddlebagged onto the tower that we designed for it. I'm not going to present the tower today, but it involved this incredible moment where we got to design the MBTA, the Red Line stop, on the Red Line, the Red Line stop at Kendall Square, which involved 3 head houses, an elevator, a stair, an escalator, all intertwined with the garage and loading docks underground to the south, but then a symbolic gate above, that is the gate to MIT. It is a tight space, so instead of being a threshold that you go through, it's an elongated canopy that's over 100 feet long that marks the passage of that entry. Conceptually, it is the connection of town and gown, activating Main Street. connecting on the right to MIT in the Infinite Corridor. There's the admissions area to the north and MIT Museum to the south, the elongation of that gateway on the diagonal to connect to the Infinite Corridor, and the transverse connection of pedestrian passageways as one gets to go into and connect buildings amongst them. As one goes down into the basement, of course, the main function of this is to get to the subway, connecting regionally to Alewife on one side and Quincy to the other side. And all of these are like an iceberg that emanate into these crystal pavilions that come above the ground, but then are united by a very delicate centipede, if you like, a figure that strategically pins its columns, needle-like as they are, on the points where the foundation can take them. You can see that there's no lateral structure on this building. It stands because of the redundancy of these columns acting together. In other words, there are no diagonal members, there's no shear walls. The columns act in unison to essentially hold up two monocoques, what they're actually holding down. The wind forces that want to pick this up like a sail are far more stringent than what it's actually holding up. And then the semi-reflective surface of the reflected ceiling plan, as it were, allows the kind of the urban life of that moment to be mapped out onto the ground. Similarly, we had this incredible experience in Melbourne in collaboration with John Wardle, where we were commissioned to do a pedestrian bridge on the Yarra River. The pedestrian bridge is used no more than 2 weeks a year to go to the Tennis Open. The rest of the year, it's experienced in the park on the Yarra River. So you're never seeing this view. You're always looking up at the bridge from below. And we wanted to design and build something structurally more adventurous, potentially exposing the rebar from which one could entangle structure, mapping out the maximum moment on the bulge of the bridge, what you see in precedence as singular thick members, asking ourselves, well, what would it mean if we intertwined and made redundancies out of all of that mesh to produce the bundling of the moment, the maximum moment that is in the belly of this beast. And so that became the means through which a very complex array of back and forth Zooms happened between us and Wardle, us being kind of the digital motor behind this, and them being the kind of the team that's very much in dialogue with the construction industry over there, essentially wrapping the structure to become the railing. And as one wraps above and over the railing, extends it up into the lighting and essentially entangles it with a truss that is at the core of the structure at the long spans, and then at the end connects to the lighting above. All of this has this kind of key moment where you're sort of below and above. The topography is not entirely flat. There are moments where you get to go up through the vortex of the different paths, where you get to experience the line between above and below. Now, some of these buildings and bridges and infrastructures are also informed by our research. And so, in some ways, I was never successful in structure in school, but it became a kind of interest of mine to figure out how to deal with structure in more informative ways, where structure is a kind of catalyst for a different kind of thinking. Looking at Gaudi's work, of course, the hanging of chains and the idea that the optimization of structure can be calculated through gravity became a means for which to do an installation at the Boston Society of Architects, what we're now redesigning as I speak here. It's called the compressive catenary, and it stems from the idea that a basic arch stands because of its keystone. If we were to invert that keystone and make it a puzzle piece where they're acting in tension rather than in compression, it works just as well. And so for that piece, effectively, we suspended dense foam. It's not concrete, actually. It's compressed dense foam into these keystone pieces that are locked within each other that amount to a central oculus that would then be slung over the infamous stair by Howler-Yoon that was in that space. Now, all of these things, I'm not really showing anything in precise chronology, but you are also seeing that there's certain themes, not only about the reflected ceiling plan, but also the suspended structure, and that was a super important thing for the Georgia Tech project at the Hinman Building. I was very lucky to be in Atlanta for 1 year doing research with the students on different material conditions and testing out different means and methods. And the year after that, I was also fortunate enough to team up with LAS for the commission of the Hinman Building, which is comprised of this incredible high bay structure, a research interior that was for the engineering building that would become the home of the master's program for their architecture school. And it's an important space because it connects the main quad to what is now a kind of outdoor fab lab in the back. So it has an urban capacity to it as a kind of passage through, but large enough to have installations and events in there that conjure up urbanism or a space of the sublime. And so our immediate strategy, and I should say also that this happened in 2008. So the budget went from 19 million to 11. So it's not a high budget, but the strategy ended up benefiting the scheme. We asked ourselves, what would it mean to hang the interventions in the scheme to keep the floor free so that you could do many other things in it over the span of a year? So all of, let's say, the electric plugins for the drafting hall, as it were, are on the ground, but then the added studio space and the connection to the second floor is through a studio space that's suspended on the gantry crane. The staircase to the second floor is suspended from the truss and hanging on the ground. And then the lighting is also on each of the struts that then goes up. And the idea of levity, I mean, there's this essentially what we call the crib is suspended in that space. There's a slight shake to it, but it produces a scenario that is substantially inconspicuous. If the idea of intervening in an existing building is to establish an ethic about what is existing and what is new, in this case, there's a stealthness to this. You don't know what the architect Heffernan did and what the architect Nader did. They are interwoven almost as if one. So small was the budget, so limited was the budget, that we didn't have enough funds to polish up the sign on the building. So the research sign, we buffed up only the ARCH to signify the transition from a research building to architecture. In all of this, we were doing at the same time an installation with the students at Georgia Tech. And we were looking at transformative tectonics. We have a natural understanding of how through the transition of temperature, water goes to ice or to snow. But in structures, we have never asked ourselves how you go from a vector active structural system to a surface active. And so we were interested in developing a unit of construction, a brick, if you wish, that has parametric qualities, that it can go from a vector active system on the left to a box beam on the right and a surface active in the middle. And that's really what we did in collaboration with the students. These are the different instantiations of that, but the ability to kind of fluently go from one condition to the other without the typological seams that would normatively have to be there is the result of, let's say, the parametric unit that looks incomprehensible visually, but in fact is hyper-rationalized through the module. And this became a very important element that informed some of the more complex work that we ended up doing with John Wardle down in Melbourne, where we were trying to develop a roof spanning over 120 feet with massive LVLs that are sometimes over 10 feet deep to conspire to become a suspended studio. This is the kind of the cousin, the next of kin of Georgia Tech, from the roof down. Similar situation on the piano nobile of this building. There's the ground of the design school. The design studio isn't in that space. The design studio is in the balconies looking into the space, and they're hot seats. So the only dedicated design studio is in that monolith that is suspended in the middle. Effectively, it's about an inverted tectonics. If a classical palazzo has the rustication at the bottom, the weight at the bottom, and the thinness of the expression of the facade above, we have the massive timber above and the suspended plywood below. The deformations of the skylight have to do with getting natural daylighting throughout the day, but no direct sunlight, as a way of mitigating the quality of light that you get on your drawing boards and on your tables. And then that inverted tectonics has these massive presence above, and then through the acoustic baffles on the monolith, it becomes a thin plane, almost like a skirt that is suspended within that space above the ground. Here, the thickness and the girth of the exposed raw wood at the top, and then the veneer that is on the bottom of the reflected ceiling plans drapes down on the face of the monolith, again, the dedicated studios, that ends up projecting itself at the bottom as acoustic baffles and a space for lighting for the conferencing area that's just below it under the fringe. Similarly, the project had an occasion to deal with an existing facade, that what's called the Joseph Reed facade, that was essentially a gift to the school some 50 years ago. A bank was torn down, and as a kind of didactic artifact, they gave a facade that was just boarded up and pasted onto the side of the building, the previous building. We drew the building, we mapped it out, we supplied it with a little bit of lateral stability on its back. We mapped out the elevation from the backside, but it needed more lateral stability. So we, in the form of a studio and a conferencing area, we vaulted from the facade over to the core of the building, a classroom that would then be suspended over the exhibition area that is on the ground. And so the whole project is really about a mediation and a negotiation between an invented structural system and a very normative classical facade. All of these, of course, done with ruled surfaces with which you are infinitely familiar in the work of Felix Candela. Felix Candela is a very important protagonist for our Daniels faculty, where you used to teach for some years. And part of it had to do with the fact that the Daniels faculty is essentially a concrete building. But when we came to design and build the roof, the contractors insisted that what we've designed is unbuildable. So we had to take the idea of the mock-up that we did earlier in our career to the next step. And we realized the problem with a concrete building at this point has nothing to do with the concrete. It has nothing to do with the exposure of the concrete or the structure. It has to do with the idea that you have to essentially build a building twice. You build the formwork, you pour the concrete, and then you have to demolish the formwork. The labor involved is incredibly excessive. And this is why your own building is so impressive right next door, because it is one of those buildings. So what we did is we built a stick version of that vault in our basement, in our fab lab. And we realized that, well, we demonstrated a proof of concept. First of all, the ruled surface is not complex. It is really a series of straight lines. But we also discovered a radiant panel within which the cooling system could be placed. Now, knowing that the concrete on the floor could house the heating, that the cooling would be above you. The cool air descends, the hot air rises. And so when you're in this studio, you're in a sandwich of environmental conditions that vary from the summer to the winter. It is fair to say that the vaults are not like Candela anymore. These are more Rubenesque, if you wish. They have more meat and flesh to them, but they effectively embody the idea of a system that is able to address simultaneously the idea of spanning 120 feet, giving natural daylighting, and then bringing all of the roof hydrology into two cisterns on either side of the facade to irrigate the landscape on the outside. I'm going on too much, but I'm going to present the last project, which is under construction. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to show the images of it, but it is a very ambitious project in the curators that have inspired it and in the work that the entire team has done on it. And so I'm very excited to present it. It has to do with the ancient West Asia collection and the Cypriot collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Effectively, an institution comprised of, I believe, 21 buildings built over 150 years. It's not a building. I see it more akin to a piece of urbanism. I've put Diocletian's palace or Split right underneath it to give you a sense of, how a building becomes a city, or in this case, how a city becomes a building. But in both cases, the site that we have just south of the Great Hall serves as a connection to the Islamic wing on one side, the painting wing of the 19th century on the other, and of course the entry vestibule, the Great Hall, to the north. The problem with it is that it is at the junction of two buildings, or actually three buildings, but at one junction, there's about a 4-foot gap meaning a 4-foot sectional gap. And so effectively, it's not accessible. One of the most important museums in the United States, if not the world, is inaccessible. And so disguised as a problem of accessibility, it became also an architectural opportunity. How do you bring people through the front door and not force them to go through the back door to get there? Needless to say, all of you have been through issues of accessibility, but in this case, transforming the space of the poché around the Jaharis vault, this is Jaharis court below, our space is in the ring of the vault around it. And so the rift between the lower and the upper sections happen right behind that vault, and the ramp gets to occur as a switchback ramp that connects the Cypriot and the ancient West Asia collections together. Meanwhile, all of that area you can see in the section is where today there's just closets. And so by demolishing those closets, essentially the poché area, you get the compression of a new gateway, a new threshold that allows, let's say, the topography of the ground and the ceiling to come together in conversation. Here you're looking at the ancient West Asia wing, going down the ramp. Here you're seeing the scaffolding behind the Assyrian court, the way that the relief panels are suspended in place. And it's a curatorial strategy of exposing how the museum works. And then the other entry lobby, which is a space of intersectionality, how the Eastern and the Western worlds come into confrontation in an orientation space. The space of the vault, laterally looking in one direction and a more immersive version within that space. The reality is that even though there's a front door to the Met, there are people that are parking in the garage coming in through the elevators on the lower left side, or people coming from the modern wing up there. So the circulation really functions in all directions, something that will change probably in the future, but is anchored by two critical spaces. One that is on the southern side of the building, where all of the curatorial strategies are exposed. I mean, you have to imagine that the emergence of the Met came through the hands of Cesnola, and the way that the artifacts made their way from the Mediterranean to the US, could have been questionable. And so part of that is to tell the story of museums as an institution, or the politics of the museum as an institution. And then, of course, the Assyrian court that I presented the backside of before. But the story, as always, goes back to the reflected ceiling plan, and nowhere like the museum is the conditioning of the room even more important. And so effectively, there are two different kinds of vaults in the two wings. There's a single vault in the ancient West Asia side, where the vault is much larger than that of Ctesiphon. But on the Cypriot side, there are dedicated and named spaces in 4 spaces, from the antiquities to the classical, to the Hellenistic, etc. And each of them required the cadence of a space within which to capture it. At the end of the day, these are not structural vaults. They're quite the opposite. They're suspended canopies. They're much more like what I started this talk with in Northeastern University. It is a vast network of infrastructures that, if anything, are contained within these striated slots with smooth GFRG surfaces, but they're more like a parachute. They're more like, we've seen generations of these in Sohn, in Baldeweg, and otherwise, and the levity that is demonstrated at the edges is a way of lightening the effect of these vaults. They don't touch the walls. In fact, we've even have a light slot in there so that they slightly glow. Here you're looking at the Cypriot side. Originally, and oddly enough, the two collections were separated in an odd way and asymmetrically. Our only intervention into this was A, to take the walls down, and B, make them symmetrical so that there is a clarity between, a thematic and spatial clarity between what's on the west side and what's on the east side. It took them 5 years to educate us about all the artifacts. There's over 10,000 artifacts that they have, 2,000 of them which make it into the space, and hundreds of ways for them to tell the stories. I'm not going to take you through all of that, but suffice it to say, in an environment where they want everything exposed, there are models of curatorial strategies with which you are familiar that make it both extraordinary, but also difficult to read. And so there came a time where we had to identify, how do you make space where all of that space is infinite? And so we brought the metaphor of the carpet to them, and the idea that in a place without walls, how do you make the carpets define a space in the same way that you use a vault to make another space? Moments of clarity, of spatial clarity that contain certain collections. In this case, you are in the entry vestibule, the space of intersectionality. As you go up the stairs, you see the ramp to the left, and you're in the ancient period where metallurgy and bronze are discovered, and part of it is to tell the story of labor and craft that comes with the discovery of the resources. In other areas like the sanctuary of Golgoy is characterized by this bearded man, this incredible figure that stands at the center of this image, framed by the dark stone that articulates the stone of that sanctuary. And as you reverse out into the cadence of domes that takes you to the painting galleries, you realize that, well, this is the source and the foundation for the paintings of the 18th and 19th century, right to your left. Now, amongst others, there are two characteristic ways of dealing with the problem of ambience, character, and iconography in museums. This is a reductive way of putting it, but on the one hand, and they're both beautiful, I should say, but you've got Tom Pfeiffer's alleged neutrality of the vanilla box on the left with the beautiful skylights, and then on the right you have the immersive environment of Machado Silvetti's Malibu intervention, where the materials, the patterns, and the iconography of the interiors produces the social context within which these artifacts may have once existed. And we're trying not to produce the condition of the latter, even though we want to use the materials and the pungency of the limestone and the chromatic conditions of the pebbles on the beach and the lapis lazuli of Afghanistan and all of the different conditions of materials as part of this. Here, this drawing shows you the absolute cultural rift between these two curatorial groups. If the Cypriots wanted to align themselves with the politics of the West, that is the axis of Rome and Greece, which is where the collections downstairs are in the Jahar's court, the character of those spaces reproduces the conditions of that space. Nothing could be more different than the politics of the ancient West Asians, who hitherto have been in a way marginalized or suppressed. And here they wanted to test out the problem of character, chroma, labor as part of their agenda. And so elegant as it is, the strategy on the West, as it were, has a more sober and neutral palette. And then as we get to the East, the pungency and the density of those materials comes alive through the lapis lazuli wall and the transition. In this case, there are themes and there are also chronologies. So here you're going from the ancient Persians all the way up to the Sasanians on the other side as it leads to the Islamic period. Now, interestingly enough, the commission wasn't merely an architectural one. We learned during the interview that, there are architects who get the museums of the commission, and then the scenography goes to a different architect or a different interior designer. They wanted this to be an occasion where one architect does both the scenography and the museum design. And so the idea of scenography is a central one to this, where the relationship between artifacts and the casework and the narrative are part of the same thing. And so part of the materiality is really to make these things speak to each other, and not only speak to one episode as we come to a close. And it has to do with this central pavilion in black, right between the lapis lazuli and the yellow travertine, which happens at the center of the large vault. This is meant to animate, but maybe it doesn't. Let's try it again. So the large vault, what I said, competes with Ctesiphon. In the center of that space sits an episode called Hasanlu. Hasanlu is, oh, here we go. Sorry. The transition from clay and creation to the space of the lapis lazuli, the large vaults going from north to south with Hasanlu in the center. This kind of compressive moment where a narrow slot in black is identified as a tense moment between the various episodes, historical episodes. And as you go towards the south, you pass by the Sasanian period, where you then connect back to the links towards the Islamic wing and the painting gallery all the way at the end of that frame. The so-called Black Pavilion to which I refer is Hasanlu. Hasanlu is a village, a town that would be in the northwest of what is today Iran, where there's a lot of activity. It is not clear historically, because any history that we know of this town emerges from archaeological evidences. So whether it was the Assyrians or the Urartuans that burnt it to the ground, what is impressive about the pillaging of this town had to do that it was incinerated in one moment. And the fire is what protected its artifacts. It acted as the vinegar. It acted as the salt, essentially. And so for them, for the curators, this is meant to represent and embody, essentially the ugly underbelly of power. The panels are meant to compress you, but also give you the optimism of what is saved during that fire. In essence, everything that you see here is intact because of the extremity and the speed of the heat that made it possible. And then the materiality of our museum is what allows that to occur. Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. It was a great pleasure for me to see the work. And this was by the way, the ambition behind the series is to bring back our former guests to look back at the work and present some new material also. But we are very much interested in looking back and seeing the work presented in a different light. So especially for me, because I'm familiar with the project, it was interesting to see how they acquire a new meaning because you have a new lens through which you are describing them. And this is the first time I hear it. It's very interesting. And it made me wonder about to what extent is the whole narrative of the reflected ceiling, the sixth elevation, is a rhetorical / didactic device, because you are an educator also, meaning an effort to distill some kind of lesson from the collection of works, or is it actually, does it really describe a generative methodology for you that helps you actually it's a new way to approach new work? So is it like post-rationalization meant actually to instruct and to guide the interpretation of the work, or is it for you also a productive method that may lead you in the new work?
So imagine if you stumbled into a problem unconsciously and did it once, but then you realize that this is not a single moment. It is the problem of contemporary architecture. That's how it happened. Because obviously the structure at Mantra, the Hukaden, is not a suspended ceiling. It's merely a structure that is an object from the outside, but a very spatial condition on the inside. And so maybe that taught us a lesson about construction, but not necessarily about the reflected ceiling plan, even though its emergence came from our understanding that without a normative ceiling, we could not have found a way to build that. And so already something was brewing in our minds. But right as that was happening, there was an arson that happened at Northeastern. And that's what elicited the commissioning of that space. And of course, we were not thinking about the reflected ceiling plan then either. We were thinking about the problem of rituals for different religions and sacred spaces and the attributes that go into them. And we didn't have a centralized space. We had a linear space that, had to point this way, had to point that way. So the reflected plan immediately became this mechanism through which both the iconography of the space, but also the functionalities of different rituals could be enacted. And especially once we realized that the contractors didn't know how to build it, and that we had to close the job site at 4 p.m. and then teach them how to do it. That was the initial didactic moment. It was not actually in the context of the academy. We realized that here are experts in construction who would not know how to build this, but because we know exactly how to create templates and how to calibrate curvature and tolerance on a shingled system, that we could get this up. We actually built the first dome for them, with them watching us and supporting us, and then they built the other two domes. So my response to you is both and, that it emerged unconsciously as just us designing, and then realizing that this is possibly the single most important thing that we might be dealing with as we go forward.
Also thinking that what may attract you to the ceiling, is why it's a recurrent theme in your work, is that it's the instance where architecture is liberated from function, basically.
Yeah.
It's a pure, like this is how Loos defines architecture, like the tomb, because it has no utility, it's pure symbol. Does that resonate, right?
Yeah, it does. And that actually comes from a long debate that you'll appreciate, was a long drive with myself and Scott Cohen driving 5 hours from Boston to, I think, Rochester, where there was some symposium, and he was trying to describe this phenomena as I was doing to him. But it is that the function of the dome there's no, for all the flatness that we are submitted to on the ground, the gravity, the steps, the ramps, that is liberated from all of that. It has other structural functions, but it can refer to the divine. It can refer to the celestial. It's something else.
And this is a made central theme, I think, in the work, because ostensibly you are very much preoccupied with structure. Like, so much of the work has to do with this, structural inventions. But what they serve is not really, efficiencies or optimization, sustainability. It's more of a rhetorical project, right? For you, structure is about a kind of a elucidation of some clarity in the organization of the architecture.
And I didn't talk about that much today, but there's another lecture that I could give about just tectonics and how maybe different traditions have treated it. Let's say and here I'll bastardize it a little bit, but maybe somewhere between Ruskin and Frampton, there is an associated morality about the truth to a material, or the way that this unit of construction is meant to behave. But on the other end of the spectrum, let's say there's the axis of architecture parlante and the idea of architecture as language, where all of tectonics is about the mediation of actual structure and presumed structure or expressed structure, and that architecture is in that strange negotiation. And our work is obviously more leaning towards the latter. We do not moralize an alleged truth, because the majority of what you need to do has to be fireproofed. It has to be supplanted with systems and so forth, and they have to go somewhere. And so, how do you give it presence if you don't want it all to be exposed when you know it can't be exposed?
So in a way, for you, those structure is more about telling stories rather than fulfilling a pragmatic function.
Very much so. And I think actually, in that sense, Kahn is very much misconstrued. I think he understood this much more than the way that we teach Kahn today. What does the brick want to be?
Right.
He knew exactly well that Rochester and Exeter were thin bricks, and the way that he details those buildings in a way articulates that thinness in the way that he treats the location of the glass and the turning of the corners. It's for me, it's very important to revisit Kahn maybe in light of Venturi, or in light of this interpretation of tectonics.
Then let me ask you then, given what we were talking about. Why, I have a theory, but I want to hear it from you. Why do you think you are the go-to architect for designing schools of architecture? I don't think there's anyone who has designed as many as you have, correct? How many? Four. Four.
The reality is that three of them happened in the crisis at 2008. So there's a historical answer to this, and that is that we charretted for 12 months. We did about 10 or 12 competitions. Three of them were for schools of architecture, and the probabilities of landing all three of them were next to nil. Now, the next question is, okay, why after the fact are we known to do schools of architecture? Is I would probably say that my commitment, okay, if architecture is not merely about building, but raising the act of building to a sense of awareness or self-consciousness, then teaching and learning is all about the revelation of the artifice of what we do as architects. And schools of architecture are not merely just spaces to learn. They become didactic artifacts de facto. You have major students and teachers. The audience, the alumni of that building are all critics of it. They can all read the building as well as you can, if not better, or they can be better critics of it. So in both its manifestation, whether as failure or success, it is very much on stage at all times. So my sense is that the response, like beyond the responsibility of working well and not leaking, it has to do way much more. It has to be a great pedagogical device.
Right. Okay. So you confirmed my suspicion. But in addition to this, I'm wondering, this is my last question because I'm sure there are others. Do you also, when you are in the process of designing a school of architecture and working with the client, you also explore ideas about architectural education, new curricula, and how they are deployed?
Very, very important. I mean, first of all, I have to say that both Melbourne and Daniels were not the result of the designers sitting in their space designing cool things. They were exactly the opposite. Both projects started with about 3 to 6 months of focus groups looking at each different research entity within those two universities, and then absorbing their program into the building, and then asking how would the building be formed or reformed in accordance with their priorities. I didn't present that, of course, today because that's not the theme of today, but there is I think the Daniels faculty is a good one to illustrate that with. You know, the roof of that building, which I describe as the skylight, it actually extends all the way across, and it becomes the grid lab. The grid lab is owned essentially by the landscape department at Daniels. They programmed it, they conceived it, and for us it was a gift because it functionalized the roof, meaning that the roof.
To describe what the grid lab is.
Actually, what does it stand for? I
They
forget.
explore green roof technology, right?
No, it's not. No, it's not just green roof technology. They explore flora and
planted roofs. Yes, right.
But essentially,
green, I mean it literally.
Yeah. So, right. But it's a central part of their pedagogy, and you can't do that indoors. But the idea that that's a living roof is a central part of it. The other part of that the Daniels faculty is super interesting is that, if you leave us in a room, we'll design everything. But the reality is that we collaborated with all of the students and the faculty and the departments to do that. They had such a low budget that we realized that we may be able to build the whole project by having all of the millwork done in-house. So the entire project was finished the Fab Lab was completed, and then that Fab Lab ended up becoming the workshop for the design of all of the millwork that's inside there, which is, there's Richard Summer, the dean, there is the head of the Fab Lab, there was a team of students, and there was us. And that was done collaboratively. So, but of course, that was also a moment where the Daniels was going from, let's say, an analog world to a digital world. And so we were as much teaching them about, digital fabrication as much as they were recalibrating their ambitions of, the fast wood shop to an expanded robotic territory about, how these spaces may reframe their relationship to pedagogy in general. So I think that that's a very important question, particularly in light of the fact that, I don't know, in many schools, studios aren't used as much. I mean, in Cooper they are still, but I know that in some places they're not the center of things because people are on their laptops or they're at home or something. So you have to find a purpose, a pedagogical purpose for what you're doing at the same time. And of course, pedagogies are transforming as we speak. The discussion of AI is not new, but it's also wasn't there 10 years ago in the same way. So we have other urgencies that we're attending to.
Question. Complex commentaries to make, and bear with me as I sort of drip them in, okay? First, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the clarity of your presentation. In this series, one comes into contact with something which is not professional jargon, which is necessary, such as pedagogy as a term. Yeah. But there is an artifice to the current presentation from the Northeastern schools, which is extremely irritating. And you're totally free of that. Thank you. Okay. The second thought because I'm bringing the discourse from Iran to you. How's that? Well, I don't know, but you've described everything so clearly, and it's been a wonderful experience to remember that can be done. Now, the second thing was I was struck over and over again by the brilliance of it, just the brilliance, and that is a pretty thin word. But somehow it entered my mind, the Spanish term, which is deslumbrante. And that is slightly different because it's actually what had the action that brilliance has on, in this case, myself, the action that brilliance has on that who perceive the brilliance. Oh. And deslumbrante actually means blindingly brilliant. It's a brilliance that blinds, right? And it destabilizes. And I think that is which you're completely capable of. But I do not believe, and by the way, it is a compliment in Spanish. It is principally a compliment to be deslumbrante, but it is not entirely a compliment. There's some reserve that I have actually lost my bearings because it is so brilliant, if you see what I mean. So take it as a compliment. It's an enormous compliment.
Thank you.
But there's a little hesitation, which is, must I actually be blinded? Is that necessary? And that brings up an issue that I feel is coming up more and more. And I want to bring up one of my favorite architects, Arquitectónica. And that is, there's a kind of allergy that's arising to architecture. And it's in the very young, and it's a kind of allergy that's coming up when, for example, you're pushing too hard, you're branding too hard. It's not over design, it's more subtle than that. But you've noticed how the young people actually, how laid back they are. And in some ways, how they fear
our generation's excitement. You get excited, I get excitement. I get excited about things, and you can see the young people in the class going, whoa, what's happening? You know, it's a little bit, so there's a kind of laid back quality to the younger people. And that laid back quality is much more evident in your younger building, in the first buildings you presented, than in the later ones. And I want to bring up Arquitectónica at this moment before I get back to you. If you visit their office building in Coconut Grove, it is a building that has completely avoided architecture. And it is very, very difficult to do because it is not minimalism at all. It's a kind of, and there's an old German word, which is Sachlichkeit, you know, the neues Sachlichkeit, which actually means a certain matter of factness. And that building, which I consider to be actually a kind of lodestar for me, at least personally, is a building in which actually nothing very much matters. And that's very hard to do. Now, what do I appreciate about it? What I appreciate about it is that it leaves me alone, as it were, to have a conversation with Bernardo or to have lunch without constantly being drawn to admire the architect. I sometimes feel when I'm in brilliant architecture, hey, listen, I'm having lunch. Can you just leave me alone? You know, why do I have to? Why? I know it's fantastic. I admire. Why are you constantly drawing me up to admire you constantly? I'm allergic to that. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it. I want to be left alone by architecture. And it's really hard to do because it's not minimalism. But I think that your earlier buildings and by the way, one of the interesting themes about you is how often you said the budget was limited or the budget was cut. Do you see what I mean?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. And the budget is always limited and always cut in the vernacular. The vernacular architecture has an intrinsic limit, which is it's not all the money I would wish to have because I'm just a peasant in Greece or whatever. And all the vernaculars share that. And what arises from that is cunning. The way you were so cunning when your budget was cut. And I think there's a big difference between your earlier buildings that were cunning and your later buildings that were brilliant. And I prefer the earlier ones. Now, if I were to hire you to the School of Architecture, I would tell you that you had $20 million to do it, and I would cut it back to 8.
By the way,
you see, so you'd be worked up. Your spells would be done, and then we'd pull you back to be cunning.
The Nebraska project is my attempt to reel back into this discussion because of the rawness of its condition. It is not. I mean, I'm not claiming that it doesn't have the same contrivances and the same excesses, but let's say the idea that the whole thing was prefab, the idea that the whole thing was exposed and raw is an avenue.
You should clarify that it was not necessarily chronological.
Chronological. It was the first project was the last project we just completed.
Yeah. No, that was the first project you showed where you were severely constrained, in which you said that 3 visits, no contractor.
In a good way, I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that was the one that sort of really grabbed me.
So, by the way, you know, I'm very jealous of the Belgians and the Swiss for this reason. Yeah, because they are able to do those things with far less effort and far less dancing. And you know, I could never, ever digest my own meals in Bank Restaurant. I mean, it was like a grand event to go there, but I never enjoyed the food for exactly the same reasons that you said.
Yeah. You know, leave me alone. By the way, do visit that very, I think a very important building, which is Arquitectónica's headquarters. And just look at the detail. Look at how kind of careless they are, and how hard it is to give that feeling of just I'm having coffee, thank you. You know, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's at least personally where I'm at. And I think I'm being taught to be this way by my young students who are really unimpressed by histrionics or even brilliance.
Thank you. That was the best analysis I've gotten in years.
How Venturi's playing a role in your thoughts. And while you're at it, what do you glean from Frampton?
So I guess the reason I bring up Venturi is in his book, Complexity and Contradiction, he deals with the issue of rhetoric that Rodolphe brings up in maybe the most explicit way and maybe the most interesting way, because he appeals to a pretty vast repertoire of historical buildings. By the way, I never understood in my earlier years how his own work related to that. I was unable to read it. It just was not accessible to me. And it's taken me years to find a way to stitch, the last pages of the book to the first. But in the era in which we were educated, in the early to mid 80s, the question of language, architecture was a question of language. And this is, in the hands of Rodolfo Machado, who was the head of RISD at the time, Jorge Salvetti, his partner, was at Harvard. And, for kids that were 18, 19 years old, we hadn't yet entered into the myriads of theoretical approaches. And so you took language as nature, as self-evident. And so Venturi was an extension of that. But of course, as you read more and as you enter into other discourses, you see the leaks in your own pedagogy, in your own learning, in the teachings of your own professors. But strangely, I ended up learning more and more from Venturi after that, because I was able to connect it back to Kahn. And this is why I said what I did to Rodolphe about the way that, what I love about Kahn is that, he goes to the Rome, he goes to the ancients, and he comes back here and says, well, we can't build thick walls anymore. But what I can do is I can take a very thin row of bricks and crenellate them in plan to produce the illusion of depth where there is none. And for me, the idea that he's able to conjure up the idea of the monolithicness of that brick in an instance when it's a veneer off of a block wall or off of a stud wall is nothing less than extraordinary. And in the best of Kahn, he was the Neue Sachlichkeit. He was able to just present the brick as a mass. It's just a mass of brick. It could completely disappear. So, but then in the 90s, language became a four-letter word. Architecture evolved into other discourses. Deleuze and Guattari, amongst many other people, refuted the self-evident presence of architecture as language. And of course, that debate has gone around and come around through other twists and turns several times. I'm not a young architect anymore. I'm not a young teacher anymore. And so, I've been around the block a few times. So I neither elevate the problem of language, nor do I bury it under the carpet. I still think, after all these years, there are few contemporary books that remain that relevant. I still think Venturi's is.
I'd like to say a few things. I always comment about what other people say, and I'm not going to do that. But I teach a lot, and I've done a lot of adaptive reuse and really 14th century, 15th century type buildings, conversions, and so forth. And I also studied a lot of history, and I went to school even before you, in which Bannister Fletcher was the god, and we got examined on that as well. There were 100 questions on an exam to get a license in New York State. And I think it's very important. And I find it's a problem I have with teaching my students here, that they basically have no real historical contextualness at all. And I love what you said about, or the relevance, even when you got into the museum. Since you got to do and work with the curation as well, you really had to get into that context. And I think it's something very important, and I really believe there should be more of it, that type of thinking. That's one. Now on a commercial side, you did all those universities, you did the museum and so forth. Were those all open competitions or invited competitions, or they just selected you?
Oh, no. All of them were actually quite competitive. The Georgia Tech one was a call for proposals, and we went through the whole process of getting longlisted, shortlisted, and then go to the interview. And part of I always say the success of that is that we were able to forge a believable relationship with Lord Acton Sargent, with them leading the historic preservation and us leading the intervention and making a connection with the pedagogies. And Jack Pyburn, I don't know if he's a name here or not, but he was my mentor in historic preservation, and we just ended up really working very well together. The Daniels faculty and Melbourne School of Design were open international competitions initially. No, sorry, I'm getting that wrong. Melbourne was an open international competition, and it came about in a very anecdotal interest. It's not pedagogically interesting, but I'd been to Australia for the opening of the Monash architecture program. They'd asked me to do a keynote, and I did it. And so I was interviewed by a magazine, and they published a whole bunch of stuff done by us, and it was just nice. It was just a good feeling. I went back and I got back to my drawing board, and I saw a lot of great buildings there. And just I realized that there's this other architectural culture in Australia. We just don't get to see it because it's down under, it's somewhere else, right? So, and one of the works I saw was by John Wardle, the very person who called me about a month later after my return, saying that, and he spoke Australian, so I didn't understand the word he said, but I did get that there was a competition. I did understand he wanted to team with us. I understood by Googling him during that conversation who he was and that I'd visited his buildings. And he's about 10 years older than me. So he also came in with a hell of a lot more experience than we did. And I couldn't figure out why would he call us to team up with him outside of the more immediate sensibilities that we shared together. We did, like our buildings and his buildings, I think could be analyzed through a similar lens. Anyway, long story short, I know the answer of that after the fact. Politically, they wanted somebody from the Ivy League to partner up with somebody local. And what happened ultimately is that there were all these great architects, and we didn't make a great proposal, by the way. We took apart the problems that they asked for, but we didn't make a great building. Diller Scofidia did this extraordinary building, and at the end, there was 8, then there was 4, then there was 2, and it was us and Diller Scofidio. The difference was that Diller Scofidio chose a good local corporate architect of record with them as the designers. We did something different. We said we're going to do it together from beginning to end. And it was fortuitous that for whatever reason, John, who was meant to lecture in the public lecture with me on the night of the big public presentation, was called for a very important project that he was doing in Brisbane. So I had to give the proposal. And I redid the presentation entirely. I interwove his projects and ours in such a way that you couldn't tell them apart. And I presented their projects as if they were ours and vice versa. And they realized, this is, I know after the fact, they realized that we were already a team. In other words, we were working synthetically. I think
Daniel's was like 6 by 2.
it was, yeah, or maybe it was more open at first and then it came down. But ultimately, it was a slightly
Open competition, in a world open competition.
no, to two stage.
2 stages.
So
First,
what happens is that you don't get paid in the first instance. And by the way, John called me 4 days before it was due. I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, think of the time. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here.
12 hours.
So technically we have 6 days between the two of us. And it's only 11 by 17. So we did a good job on that initial submission that got us into the long list. And that was great. I forget exactly the Daniels part of it, but it was also, I think the Daniels one had more to do with a latent connection between George Baird, who was leading the school or the competition at the time, and the Northeast culture that was made reference to before, that there were others like Stephen Hall, Rex, Sarbrook Hutton, but they were a familiar group of people, all slightly more either elevated than us, but we were very lucky to have been selected, not for that project, by the way, for the College Street site. And when they abandoned that site and went to Spadina Circle, they transported the architects with the project, which is why we were so lucky.
I bring this up only not for me, but we have a lot of young students here, and I don't think they really understand what it's like that in the real world and what it means to deal in competitions, or it means to get out there so people know who you are, those different kinds of things. None of that is really exposed to students in any architectural schools.
I can tell you one thing. Now in hindsight, I know exactly how lucky we were in that particular moment in time, because now that we have evidence of a substantial body of work, which is, to some degree successful, we have also lost exactly 3 years, almost every single shortlist. So that doesn't necessarily translate into immediate success. That luck also has something to do with it. You can work very hard. You can sometimes be overzealous with the work that you're doing, and maybe not leave enough to the imagination of the critics or the committees. So that's also important.
Well, we also discussed Switzerland and Belgium, and the European model is so different than here in America, because the European offices, they live and die on competitions, and they don't get paid for 90% of them.
Right.
And that's why those offices there tend to be rather small. And then they bring in people, or they get their students from school. It's a different model than anything here in America.
One more question.
Thanks for this lecture. As we have a lot of students with us, and yourself being an architect and an educator as well, I really wanted to have your take on the future of architectural education and the future of architectural practice in this age of artificial intelligence, of speed, of intensive digitalization, but also, successive political fragmentation all over the world and also in this country. How do you really foresee the future of architectural education and architectural profession?
It's $1 million question. I don't pretend to have an answer for it, but I can at least give you clues as to what we've been through in the last 20 years, where we graduated drawing by pencil and then incrementally learned AutoCAD, Form Z, Rhino, Revit, Grasshopper, and I'm bad at all of the above, but have just enough knowledge of each of them that I know when somebody in front of me is misconstruing geometry or the layering of different things, that they're already down the wrong path. And so there's something that has to do with what I'll call the means and methods, not of construction in this case, but of the software that is instrumental to a way of thinking also, that is going to be critical. So, and I've done just a little bit of playing with AI. So I've seen where its intelligence is, especially when you brought up the question of speed, because I was asked to, in the last minute, to write a tribute to Michael Young, who's the incoming dean at Cooper. And I decided that I would write a poem because everybody in the school knows that I don't do poetry. So I did it through AI. And I worked basically for about 1 hour revisiting prompts back and forth. And eventually something interesting came out of it. But I realized also that it has its weaknesses. But all of this is to say that on the one hand, I'm one of the people that is prone to embrace all of these new conditions, but they only demonstrate a few things that I'm still bound to. One, with all of the things that we do online, with John Wardle on Zoom and all of that, it was all very helpful, except that it wouldn't have been possible without the in-person stuff. And I stand by that in our office and at school. The other types of emotional intelligence and the personal rapport that is produced by a space of pedagogy. So there's something about slowness that needs to remain there. The other thing that you brought up was history. And I would say broaden that into the humanities in general. We can learn technically almost anything. And if all of those technical stuff are supplanted in some way or another by the automation of AI or the immediacy of another software, that in and of itself does not translate into critical thinking, because the limitations of all of these softwares in many ways are defined by the architecture of that software. And that's why they are incredibly fetal at this moment. They're not as sophisticated as we think they are, as unsophisticated as they actually are. The amount of mistakes that are made in AI are exorbitant. I'm not saying that they won't get better. What I'm saying is that in a strange way, with the digital revolution, we ended up doing way more work. Why? Because the automation that it produced gave us many other versions of the things that we would have studied. The intensity with which we had to gain a critical eye onto looking at 12 things and recognizing that 11 of them were dreadfully bad became a much more important part of our intellectual craft. So I guess I'm trying to say is that I in some ways I'm lamenting the possibility that future students may abandon certain other things that we hold true in education today. But I also think that it may give more of a space in future educations to focus on critical thinking, where certain things that can be automated should be automated, and allow that workflow to be absorbed back into the way that your critical thinking is formed around it. How that's going to happen, I don't know, but this is the way that I'm tangoing with it right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.